Welcome back, Disruptors, to season 2 of the Liberation Lab podcast. We are centering healing and humanity. In this episode, I welcome my first guest, Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz. She's an amazing, brilliant scholar who will bring insights into how we center healing in education. I invite you to pull up a chair, pop this in on your ride, and tap into the insight she provides. I also want to invite you to tap into the work we're doing at Liberation Lab by visiting myliberationlab.com and subscribing to our newsletter. And there you can get in touch with the work that I do with schools through our pillars of culturally responsive teaching, social justice education, and restorative practices. Till next week, Disruptor, let's keep pushing. Welcome to Liberation Lab podcast, insights and interviews for the disruptive educator. I am honored to have my guest. I'm going to let her introduce herself. Why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Yes. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, poet, scholar, activist. Just made full professor in January at Teachers College, Columbia University, and just someone who's trying to do right in the world on behalf of Black children and, by extension, brown children. And using my platform, my creativity to do that kind of work and also bring healing, because healing has to be part of it, specifically when you're advocating, pushing for, fighting for Black children. Healing has to be a part of it because there will be wounds.
It's almost like, you're queuing us up for exactly where I want to go. Your last phrase there will be wounds. There's a lot of educators, who have tapped into, what I've been trying to do here with Liberation Lab, the podcast, the consulting, all the things. And one of the things that comes up is almost like and I use this term sticking close to the definition, an ignorance almost about the ways in which education can give wounds. And so, I believe in experiential knowledge, believe that sometimes people need to hear not just data on a page, but stories that they can resonate with. And so I want to start this way. As you think back to your experience in education, whether it be by you, your lovely daughter, and all the things, what are some of the ways that you can kind of personalize the story of wounding for folks so it becomes real?
Oh my gosh, thank you for that, brother. And I just want to take a moment to thank you for this, to thank for the service. And it is service to not just our people, but to educators. And we're very clear about that. And using this as a platform to open minds, but also to open hearts. And that is not easy work, because if you know anything about, human beings, you know that we can be resilient, but we can also be resistant. And it's difficult for me to even hear what you're saying, because all we have to do is look through history.
Yeah.
And education, schools have always been a battleground, particularly for Black children, right? And for others as well, but particularly for Black children. Brown versus Board of Education, and all of the cases that were part of that. That's because Black children were being wounded. Education, schools, was a site of trauma.
Yeah.
And certainly my experience was no different. Going to school in the South Bronx, what I remember most are teachers who actually cared. So I can count on my one hand probably those teachers who really cared, because the default was this lack of belief in who we are, deficit notion about us and the zip code that we were from. Boom. So there you go with that. Fast forward many decades later, and I've written about this piece with my daughter, the piece on racial literacy, a mother-daughter perspective, right?
Yeah.
About my daughter here in a so-called independent school, getting harmed by not just the white folks there and kind of their benign neglect, but the actual piece that we wrote about was a comment that came from a teacher of color in an independent school. So when we talk about wounds, we're talking about teachers, individuals who have their own wounds, who don't do the work around healing, and then they exact those wounds on the students. So what I'm loving about what you're mentioning and what you're asking me to talk about, and what I want to say very clearly, is that education for Black children, schools, is a site of trauma and multiple wounds, and it also has the potential to be a site of healing.
Mhm.
But until the educator does their own work, they really won't know what side they're on. Are you
Wow.
healing or are you harming?
Is there a middle ground? For folks who are listening to you, they're probably like, well, what if I'm not doing either? That, people want to fit. People search for the, to be neutral.
Bobby, there's no neutrality. There's no neutrality in education. There's no neutrality in this country when it comes to race. And race is the formula that created this country. This country has never been race neutral. Therefore, the education system, the healthcare system, the criminal injustice system cannot be race neutral. So if you're a teacher and you want to ignore, and I'm talking about teachers of all persuasions, if you're Black, you're going to deal with your own sort of internalized racism and this, it's depending on, how much you're loving whiteness. That's something that
Yeah.
you're going to have to unravel for yourself, right?
Yeah.
And the loving of whiteness often comes because it is so painful to deal with the way Blackness is treated. And
Yeah.
so when you begin to get, let's say, a job or decent money, all of those things that in this society people are pushed to crave for, uh, it makes it a little bit easier to have amnesia.
Yeah.
You can
Yeah.
never really forget because it's constantly all around you.
Hmm.
So there cannot be, this is me speaking from my experience teaching for 29 years, leaning into history, there is no neutral ground. And to believe that there's a neutral ground is a way out because that gives you the escape hatch to not put anything on the line. And as
Hmm.
educators, particularly in this time, like Uncle Jimmy, James Baldwin told us, you have to be willing to go for broke, which means you have to be willing to put something on the line. If you're
Yeah.
neutral, hey, everything's cool.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
such thing.
So much of what you said there, obviously I resonate with, and it's the same thing that I put out there for teachers that there can be no middle ground. That visually, I think about it like the walkways in the airport.
Mm.
We can stand on the walkway, and it'll if we're doing nothing, it's still moving us in the same direction. In order for us to actually move against the current, not only do we have to turn around, but we have to walk faster in the opposite direction in order for it
Whoa.
to make sense, in order for us
Whoa.
to move. And so for us, the non neutral stance is saying turn around, walk against the current, and walk faster than the current is carrying you in its default mode setting.
Oh my God. Let's say that metaphor, that whole, that's brilliant. I hope it's something that you can, write about, maybe even dedicate a whole podcast to.
Hmm.
Just brilliant.
I
And yes,
appreciate you.
oh, I appreciate you. Wow, 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 wow. Yeah. And you know what else I was thinking?
Yeah.
Not only will it take agency to turn
Hmm.
around and walk against the current that is, that if you think you're going to remain neutral and even just kind of go in the same direction, if you don't lift your feet, you're going to trip and fall. So
Yeah.
even if you stay right on that moving walkway and you just say, everything is good, I don't really have to do anything, try not lifting your feet and see how quickly you'll trip and fall on your face.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that educators, you know, I was saying before we hit record that all that I do, and in the vein of Uncle Jimmy and behind me here, is serving to as an alarm clock to wake people up, but also I want to give you a new lens to see the world. So I hope to hand you a pair of eyeglasses, right? And so I hope that educators who are listening would hear from us an invitation more
Mm-hmm.
than a criticism. Because
Mm-hmm.
when we hear things that bring truth, we all have an inner lawyer that rises up to our defense versus taking it in and saying, what am I being invited to do here? How am I being invited to respond here? So my hope is that educators are listening in order to be invited into a process of responding. But in order to do that, I think that there's some things that we have to do. So we said earlier, we mentioned the term whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I have said this word, I don't care if it's been in a podcast, I don't care if it has been in my writing, I don't care if it has been in short form content that I put up on Instagram or whatever have you. Somebody inevitably comes back and says that I'm racist because I said the word whiteness. And it always tells me that there's some level of ignorance around the term, what it means, and how it flows.
Mm-hmm.
So, for those who may have just heard this and they've had that trigger response, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? Whiteness? What?
Mm-hmm.
How can we take the cookies off the top shelf and say this is really what it means?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just say I love teachers, which is why I do the work that I do.
Yeah,
And those teachers where my work hits differently, and it will hit differently, hopefully, for the spectrum of teachers who are out there. And my hope is that they will get an inkling of the message for them to do self-reflection. So I
yeah,
do this work because, number one, I love Black children. I love children of color. I love all children, but Black and brown children have been the ones that have been most wounded. Children with disabilities of all, so-called colors have been most wounded. And so this work I do, it has to be based in critical love. Certainly,
yeah,
first love for the students, but certainly love for the teachers.
yeah,
Auntie Maya says, you know better, you do better. That is what drives me. In terms of whiteness, and I want to bring in, because I just came from this incredible conference on healing centered education that
yeah,
talks about fugitivity. And we know that fugitivity more and more is becoming a popular term in education.
mm,
And the idea of fugitivity, when you think about enslaved folks who were fugitives, were running away towards what was their God given birthright of freedom, right?
yeah,
Even though this country says you will be born enslaved, all humans are free. They
yeah,
are coming into a system where the system then politicizes their bodies and then takes away their freedom. So having said all that, that whiteness in and of itself, if you look historically, has always shifted. Whiteness is not a color. People get caught up in just like, oh, I'm a white person. And so you're therefore saying I'm white and whiteness. No, whiteness is an ideology. Whiteness
yes,
is also something that's always shifting, which is why we have to be ready to have a more expansive conversation about it. If it's
yes,
just, oh, this is white person versus black person versus that, no, that's narrow thinking, that's static thinking, and it is not true to what the true definition is, which is an
yeah,
ideology that is always shifting depending on the times.
yeah,
What I say to educators is to expand, do a little bit of, first of all, listen to your podcasts and
mm,
to try to listen without judgment. Try to
yes,
listen with an open mind and an open heart, not because I'm asking you to do it or Bobby, you're asking them to do it, but because if you're choosing to teach children, it is your obligation to do so.
mm, mm. Folks that hear that term and have visceral responses tend to believe or fall into the trap of feeling like their character, their identity is being attacked. And what I hope to that people are being invited into in this space and in this conversation is the fact that we are decentering persons
Mm-hmm.
and putting the magnifying glass, if you will, on the system, the ideology, the belief that is behind our actions, our thoughts, the ways in which our world is shaped. It's an invitation to ask better questions. How did it get this way? Why does it exist in this way? Who is benefiting from this system, the way things are carried out? Who is being harmed because of the way that this is carried out? And how do we work to change that?
Yes, and Bobby, in the spirit of your podcast, it's not just asking questions. That is the first step.
Yeah,
But it's also having people, teachers in particular, because we're talking about teachers, we know that race and whiteness impacts all facets of our society. But to
right.
also see their agency in this. You have
Hmm.
the agency, right, to listen differently, to ask different questions, and therefore to respond differently. Even though a lot of things happen onto teachers, standardized testing, all of the things that teachers have to deal with, teachers
Yeah.
still have agency. And in fact, we have a lot of power.
Yeah.
And I think it's most important what you invite folks to do through the podcast, and hopefully through this particular episode as well. It's for them to see that they have agency, that you are not a victim.
Yes.
And when you remove yourself from that victim status, perhaps you can stop seeing Black children as victims in
Hmm.
schools. Because, in the words of my dear friend Goldie, and before that, Baba Asa Hilliard, all children are geniuses.
Yes.
We need to
Yes.
lift our spirits, our thinking, our hearts. We're trapped. And even getting trapped in this argument about what is whiteness and are you talking about me? It's beyond that. Let the ego get out of the way and understand that being called to teach is of the highest honor, which
Yes.
requires you to do work that other people do not.
Yes.
Self work, historical, intellectual work, if you're going
Yeah.
to be serious about teaching all children.
To that point, when I first stepped onto the scene as an educator, I was invited, called to teach in Camden, New Jersey, voted the most dangerous city to live in at the time.
Mm.
I walked in and realized that my teacher prep did not prepare me to actually teach. I knew content.
What did they
I
prepare you for? Tell me. What did they prepare you for?
My teacher prep programs prepared me to know jargon and to know what math is, but it never really prepared me to connect math in a way that made it meaningful to the students that I was teaching. It never prepared me to connect with it assumed that the product that I was selling was good enough to be bought into without any effort on my end. That if I just build it, they will come. And that is the problem, I think, with a lot of the educational system, that we have many teachers who succeeded in this visceral, harming institution of school. They knew to sit down, to raise their hand. No, sir. They didn't question. They were quiet. They sat in their seat. They did what they were supposed to do. No, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And they succeeded. And now they're saying, well, if I succeeded, what's wrong with you?
All of it is
That,
wrong. All has been wrong.
yes. But if I've been successful at it,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to critique something that I don't think is wrong because it was right for me.
Yes.
And so teachers are walking in and they're saying, well, what's wrong with you? Because I did it. And we even hear it in some of our language. I got my degree,
Mm.
right? Um, and so my framing there is for us because here's what happened. I went into Camden, I started teaching, I realized I didn't know how to teach. The the students were gracious. They let me fall forward. They allowed me to get up and try it
Right.
again. But at the same time, I was using very high control methods that came from a place of these kids are going to do X, Y, and Z, and so I better prepare for it before it comes. And I realized that I was doing more harm than good.
Yes, Bobby.
So because I was doing more harm than good, I personally had to go on a healing journey. I had to go on a journey of unlearning the things
Yeah.
that I had taken in, and then from there rebuilding anew who I would be as an educator.
Mm.
And in that place, I think we find many educators who are recognizing, being awakened to the fact that this isn't working for everyone, but they don't know how to flip the page and begin their healing journey.
And brother,
And
can
so
I
that's
say,
where I want to call you in.
yes, brother, can I just say something about what you just said? First of all,
Please.
thank you for that vulnerability and that honesty. And really, that's what's missing.
Hmm.
Because if we really give educators an opportunity to not be judged and to honestly reflect, many of them, even those who went to school in so called affluent neighborhoods, will tell the truth that it really didn't work for them,
Yeah.
that they actually performed. And in the performance, they were not fully themselves. They performed in the way that their parents or the teachers, it's that same narrative. well, this worked for me, and you pass it down, and then the students say, well, if it worked for you, then I'm going to make it work for me. And so it
Yeah.
just becomes this perpetual lie.
Mm.
But what I have seen in my work, when we
Yeah.
talk about archaeology of self, giving teachers that open space, that honest space, more often than not, they will tell you that they just performed. It really did not work for them. Did they get a job in all those accoutrements? Yes. But what did they lose? Many of them lost their identity. I mean, the stuff that I've heard over the years. That's why I'm grateful that my work has naturally progressed into healing centered education, because most educators are wounded
Hmm. Hmm.
and really are, Bobby. And I wanted to ask you, I wonder, how is your healing going from everything you just shared? And what have you been doing to heal?
I would say the first thing that I had to do was to be honest about what transpired. We often want to cast ourselves as the heroes of our own story.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to realize that in that moment, I was the villain. I was the person creating the harm. I was the antagonist. I was the person that, you know, told students how to show up, when to show up. And if they did not show up the way I told them to, I was going to ensure that they knew that they could not arrive any other way than what I told them.
Oh my God. Yes.
And so, and so my first suggestion would be to make sure that you're casting yourself in the story the right way. We are not always the hero. And from moment to moment, that changes based upon how we're taking care of ourselves, our energy levels, um, the interactions, what our students bring in, their invisible backpacks, the things that they bring in with them that we cannot see.
Yes.
That
Yes.
that thing changes from moment to moment, and so we have to then, secondly, be responsive,
Mm.
aware, and responsive. Right. So I'm I've learned to look for how my students are arriving, because embedded in me looking for how they're arriving is a belief in their innate genius, a
Mm.
belief in what they can be,
Mm.
what they are currently and what they can be. And so I tell them all the time, I'm going to speak to your aspirational identity,
Mm.
right? I'm always going to hold the standard there. And that means when we have those gaps, I'm going to help you with that gap, right? Like if you can't give me 100% today, that's cool. Give me your 70. I'll help you with the 30,
Right. That's right.
right? But in order to do that, I had to take myself out of the main character role in the story. I had to decenter myself, and I had to put myself in a position to where I was going to be a student of my students. I was going to
Wow.
learn
Wow.
them.
So what I'm hearing from you in that bit of brilliance is that you're offering the educators listening, number one, be honest.
Yeah,
Number two, be aware. Number three, be responsive. And in being responsive, number four, your position of being a student of your student. And
absolutely.
that for me is be vulnerable.
Yes.
And that is
Yeah.
beautiful. I hope the educators are listening, because you know what? Going into this school year, it has to be
Hmm.
something. And if any
Yeah.
of you are hearing this and you have not thought about, the honesty, the awareness, the responsiveness, and humbling yourself, being vulnerable enough to be your student's student, why
Hmm.
not try it? Why not
Hmm.
try it? What can
Hmm.
what can we lose at this point? We have everything to gain.
Yeah. So let's say I'm an educator and I hear what's being shared here, and I say, "Cool, I that worked for you. That's great." Um, but let's say that doesn't work for me. How? What are some indicators? What are some ways that
Hmm.
educators can begin to process and walk in their own healing? What are some
Sure.
some tips, some things that you can give.
Sure. No, number one, you have to be patient and generous with yourself and also patient and generous with the process. This country has been at this inequality project for over 400 and something years. Don't think
Mm,
in one semester or one school year you're going to flip that. And
mhm.
so when you say, well, I tried it, it doesn't work, how long have you tried it? And it's not about trying, it really is about an orientation that becomes your stance. And
Yeah.
if it is your stance, like with anything else, you know it is going to take time for you to become comfortable in practicing that stance and for children to be able to recognize. So I
Mm,
think the first thing is to eliminate this kind of timestamp. Yes, there is an urgency. Like my dear friend Lalita Vasudevan, Dr. Lalita Vasudevan talks about patient urgency.
mm,
Absolutely, it was urgent before Brown versus Board of Education. It's especially urgent now. However, no, not however, and because of the urgency, we have to be very deliberate and we have to be consistent. So, number one, this level of patience with the process and patience and generosity with the self. And in that patience and generosity with the self, I encourage people to seek therapy. Actually, Bobby, that's one of the first questions I asked my students on the first day of class. And I said, I'm not trying to get in your business. But if we're going to have an open, honest semester where we're really trying to be our best to
yeah.
show up for students, I need to know how many of you are engaged in therapy. Show your hands. And my hand, of course, goes up.
Yeah.
And therapy is not always talk therapy. Sometimes it's pet therapy, music therapy, group therapy, singular therapy. There has to be some way that you're doing self work on your own trauma, on your own racist beliefs, sexist, homophobic, religious bias, anti black beliefs before you step into a classroom or as you're in a classroom. There's no way for you to think that what's buried deep inside will not rise up and impact the student.
Yeah.
We're not robots. This is a human endeavor teaching. Be a good
I,
human.
I think about our dear brother, Dr. Chris Emden. Um,
Mm.
I think
One of the
about,
loves of my life. Intellectual love, brother love. Thank you for evoking his name.
yeah, his work, specifically, I'm calling to for us the Ratchetdemic, and in
Mm-hmm.
that book, there's a chapter or a section where he talks about the analogy of an elevator,
Oh
and
yes, I read the book.
he says that when we are in this work of teaching, right, that we are called to rise to a different level, and in the same way that when you walk into an elevator to rise to that level, you have to push a button. And he says in that book, and I love the analogy, that students in our classrooms will push our buttons, and the question is, will you see that as an invitation to rise to a
Mm.
different level? I hope that our educators can hear that and be encouraged to 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 rise to that level, because our students deserve it,
Our
right?
students
Our babies
really do.
deserve it. The the worst thing that we can do is not only to personalize, um, when things are when a students were vendetta, and so now they have to pay the price for crossing you,
Happens all the
or
time.
absolutely. And to that point, let me parenthetically insert, I'm now in the chair as the assistant principal, so I get the student who's been kicked out of class. I get the
Yeah.
stories where it's teachers writing down this whole script of things that have transpired, and I get to ask the student, well, what happened? Talk to me. No, I went in there and I did this, and then she just kicked me out. Okay, well, let's back up. How did you enter? What were you feeling? What were you thinking? Talk to me about just you getting in. What was that like for you? And when you peel back the layers, you realize, like, most of the things that are happening aren't personal to the teacher. Sometimes it is. Sometimes our teachers will push every single button in the kid. They
Yes.
respond, and then so you can kick them out. That happens.
Yes.
But I'd like to just I just like to encourage our educators to the fact that if We are called to the work of healing. That means that we must be expecting wounds before they get to us.
Mm. Wow. Yes, Bobby. I just want
The
to sit with you for a minute.
Yeah,
Yes. And as you bring up elevators, I want to share a little bit of Black history and remind people that the elevator was created by a Black man.
that's right.
And there's
Yeah,
so many, when we talk about genius, if teachers knew, Black, white, Latinx, Asian, if more teachers knew the incredible contributions that Black folk made to their everyday lives, I do think there would be a different respect for the Black children in front of them because they would recognize that these Black children come from a powerful legacy of
yes,
inventors and contributors to human society.
yes,
That
yes,
is deeply missing. That recognizing of the genius and the generational genius and legacy of the children before them. So thank you for
yes.
the elevator, which tapped something in me. And thank you for what you just said. As educators, we have to understand, given all that we know and all that has transpired in this country, that when children show up, wounds will be present.
I would just say that I hope, and I just wrote about this, but when I take my son or my daughter to the doctor when they're sick, if my and my son, he's like me. He gets sick, everything shuts down. Um, and so when I take him to the doctor, and he's complaining about a stomach ache, and just using this as a picture here, and he begins to tell the doctor about how it hurts, and in that sentence, he just throws up on the doctor. The
Mm-hmm.
doctor will not turn around and say to me or my son that my son needs discipline. He'll
Ooh,
get curious. What did you eat? What happened before this moment? How
yes,
did you, what other symptoms are you experiencing? The throwing up is an invitation to get curious. And in the
oh,
same way, teachers, our students are going to emotionally and otherwise throw up. There's going to be
mm-hmm.
things that we may not like that come out,
Powerful, powerful,
but it is an invitation to get curious. Why do you think that? Why are you
powerful.
saying that in this moment? Is there something else that's going on? Can we talk about this? Or now may not be the right time, and that's okay. I'm going to give you space here, but I would love to talk about this in the future. I would love to talk about that at the end of the period. I would love to talk about that over lunch. Whatever it is, to give that space to come back to it rather than giving the stage and then getting mad at the show you see in your classroom. Yeah.
Bobby, you are just on fire today with these analogies and space and also grace. And here's the thing:
Yes.
space and grace for the educator and the student. See, that's the
Yes.
thing. The teacher sees how inextricably linked we are to our students. Our behavior towards them is different. We are
Yeah.
connected. So if I am granting, when I grant you space and grace in the moment, I'm doing the same for myself because I'm putting that much needed pause to give me a chance to reflect and to think differently, know the known differently, as my friend Lalitha Fazadeva would say, and giving the child that space. What
Yes.
our children are unfortunately so used to is the finger wagging and the punishment in the moment. And
Yes.
teachers, their auto response has been for certain children to do just that. How do
Yeah.
we pause and break that behavior and offer space and grace? It will make our teaching so much more manageable and, dare I say, joyful.
Hmm.
Joyful.
Imagine that joy in education. Yeah.
As it should be.
Absolutely. I can think of no better way to to pause and end our time together. But I want to invite our educators to connect with you, your work, to buy your books,
Aw.
to buy her books, y'all. buy her books.
I hope they
Um,
put it there for you. You know what I mean, Bobby? You put these things out,
yeah,
definitely not getting rich or book sales for sure. But I thank you for that because I want to put things out that I hope can speak to people's hearts and minds and souls.
yeah,
Because certainly I put my heart, my mind, and my soul into anything that I put my name next to, or I won't get
that's
it.
it. That's it. So, how can folks get in touch with you, follow you, support you?
Yes, I love the idea of following me on Instagram at Yolie underscore Sealey-Ruiz, mostly because I'm involved in a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah,
Here at Centered Work, I'm grateful to be asked to do keynotes and workshops. Many of these things are free. So it's like free PD. So
yeah,
please, at Yolie underscore Sealey-Ruiz on IG, Twitter at Ruiz Sealey, Facebook for the old heads, Yolanda Ruiz. And if you Google me, you can just get my email as well. And I encourage educators to reach out. I always want to be in fellowship. And thank you for allowing me through this podcast episode to be in fellowship with educators that I may never meet. But for them to
mm,
understand we are connected, there is that same mission that we all have, which is to show
yeah,
up in ourselves for the babies who are in front of us. Thank you. I just have
100%.
gratitude for you, Bobby.
Well, honored that you spent this time pouring in, and I'm hopeful for the educators that from this point will tap into your work and your genius and your brilliance. So thank you, Dr. Yolie, for your time.
You're welcome.